Are human beings so creative? The victory of AlphaGo over Lee Sedol begins to call into question the capacity for human beings to be creative. It would seem that perhaps AI could be more creative than humans. This question was set in perspective by a recent issue of Architectural Design, edited by Wendy Falk and Antoine Picon, where they looked at the question of digital property. For sure, with the potential copying and replication that you get from the digital domain, there is a challenge to the question of copyright itself. Once you can copy everything, how do you maintain your own digital property? And I myself have found some of my books are now available online. Someone has downloaded them, and now it is be there, but anyone else can copy them. I was asked to be the to write the counterpoint essay to this particular issue. The counterpoint essay was a way it was a way of kind of critiquing or commenting on the main body of that particular issue of architectural design as a way of kind of offering an alternative viewpoint. So the approach that I took was to question whether or not copying itself is necessarily bad. And I cited a number of theorists, from Walter Benjamin to Richard Dawkins to Judith Butler to Homi Bhabha and so on, who seem to suggest that actually it's not such a bad thing. In fact, one could even claim that the notion of copying is at the center of what it is to be human. We only become human through the process of actually copying. Human life is based on replication. So to mention some of those figures, Judith Butler, for example, is very interested as a gender theorist in how we tend to copy the models of behavior from our parents, from our teachers, and so on. And those get replicated throughout because that is how things are transmitted. As a lesbian theorist, she's interested in how one might disrupt that process of copying and introduce a new way of behavior, which then becomes copied by other people and then becomes instantiated as the hegemonic norm. But the point is, we spend our times learning how to do things by copying the models of other people. Even in the architectural office, we are, in a sense, copying. In fact, there's a theory that the whole notion of role modeling and role playing that we have in our professional life is based on how we learn as kids to play certain roles, to play doctors and nurses, cops and robbers, and so on and so on and so on. That is the basis of how we learn to operate, for example, as architects within the office. We replicate the behavior of other people that we've seen. Homi Bhabha also talks about how imitation and replication are at the heart of things like political satire. A political cartoon will present a kind of recognizable image of someone, but distorted slightly and exaggerated, but nonetheless it is a replication, imitation of that person. And similarly, you might begin to parody someone by repeating expressions that they say and exaggerating these things. They don't necessarily have to be visual forms of imitation. But perhaps the most important figure in this whole scenario is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, the scientist from the UK, invented the notion of the meme. Now, the original notion of the meme was different from how it's been used these days. What he was trying to suggest was that the notion that somehow everything was transmitted in a kind of in a vertical way, almost like genes, in a sense, like the kind of the notion that we get from Darwin, was not the only way in which we could transmit things. And he argued that many cultural practices are transmitted like a sort of virus that leap horizontally. In other words, the way that ideas are spread and the way that tunes catch on and the way that fashion catches on is by people copying other people. If someone's wearing Nike, then other people start wearing Nike. If someone's wearing Adidas, then other people start wearing Adidas. Many forms of cultural practice are formed through a kind of copying of other people. I once worked in an architectural office where I noticed that if I was humming a tune in the morning, by the end of the afternoon, many others in that office were humming the same tune. In other words, replication lies at the heart of how we transmit things. Tunes catch on, so do ideas, so do fashion items, and so on. It is at the heart of how culture itself spreads. In fact, Adorno, the German philosopher, makes the comment that the human is indissolubly linked with imitation. A human becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. And this was one of the ideas that lay at the heart of the book Camouflage that I published a few years ago, the idea that all forms of creativity ultimately come out of form of imitation, albeit maybe a creative imitation. When I first started talking about these ideas at Columbia, when I was teaching there a few years ago, my students objected. We're architects, they said. We are creative individuals. We don't copy anyone. At that point, I mentioned, I answered by saying, well, next time you get in the elevator, in the lift, and you go up in Avery Hall in Columbia, have a look around you and tell me who's not wearing black. It's almost like architects look like characters from Reservoir Dogs, or perhaps without the ties. But the fact that all architects wear black is itself another form of meme. We copy other people and repeat what they're doing. In fact, in Columbia, there used to be a joke about the fact that Bernard Tschumi, the designer of the FIU School of Architecture, was because he was used to wear red and used to stand out, everyone used to tease him mercilessly because he was wearing red. And when you think about it, much of our behavior is based on certain habits and routines. When we wake up in the morning, for example, we have a certain way of operating. We might go and take a shower, clean our teeth, have a shave or something, then put on some coffee and make that coffee in a certain way with the same type of coffee as we might always make, and so on. Human life is often structured through a kind of repetition of certain habits and certain behaviors. Why do we do this? Well, maybe it's to simply kind of structure our psychic equilibrium. We have an expression in the UK that when you're somehow feeling out of sorts one day, that maybe you got out of bed the wrong side in the morning. In other words, you have to perform these certain rituals in order to somehow maintain that psychic equilibrium. We all have our signatures, as it were, and by that I mean not just literally our signatures, our autographs. This is the signature of Elvis Presley, but many things we do are our own kind of signatures. The way we walk, the way we talk, the way we run, all sorts of things are highly recognizable. You can probably note. You can probably, when you hear the voice of your parents, you haven't got to see them to know exactly whose voice they are. Likewise, maybe from 100 yards or so, you can see who a person is by the distinctive way in which they're walking. All human life somehow seems to be governed by a certain kind of signature, a certain way of operating. It's almost as though human beings operate a little like pieces on a chessboard, particularly as they get older and some of their habits become more and more reinforced. In other words, they are constrained in their movements, just like the pieces on the chessboard, by their particular characters. So just as it is that the queen, a piece on the chessboard, can move in a very different way to a knight or a castle or a pawn, so human beings have certain character traits that govern how they behave. Some politicians, for example, find it very difficult to go backwards, to back down on a certain proposition. A bit like a pawn not being able to go backwards. They therefore double down on what they've said before and cannot retract what they've done. That, of course, leaves them very vulnerable, just as a pawn is a very vulnerable piece on a chessboard. So it's as though we ourselves are, in some senses, just like pieces on a chessboard and, in a way, constrained by our own character traits that only allow us to operate in a certain way. The idea that somehow architects are not quite as imaginative as they might claim to be could be seen in the way that we see how certain ways of operating get handed down through architecture. Even the most adventurous architects. This is a design by Jan Sung Ma, but nonetheless you can see that Jan Sung Ma, you could detect through his architecture that Jan Sung Ma was studied under Zaha Hadid at Yale University. It's as though we kind of somehow, what we do is in some senses never totally different from what's happened before. I often use the example of a pineapple. If a student produces a design that looks like a pineapple, it's not architecture. But if it's something like what Rem Koolhaas might design, or Zaha Hadid, or Jean Nouvel, or Herzog and de Meuron, or whoever, any one of these famous architects, but importantly, not the same, because that would be literal copying, that's architecture. It's a slight kind of variation on what is done before, but it's never too outrageously different. In some senses, then, we can compare architecture to jazz. Jazz, in the sense, has a kind of background, kind of rhythm that you break off and do some alternative kind of version, and then you go back to that basic sort of rhythm. It's not as though you completely destroy things. There is this background condition of which you are playing, and that, to my mind, reminds me of architecture. Architecture, to that extent, is a little like jazz. In fact, the notion that somehow you are allowed to go slightly beyond the previous model but not too far is what lies at the heart of the work of Ahmed El Galma. Ahmed is a computer scientist, not an artist, but he's recognized that actually the way that art works is that you remain fairly close to a canon of art, but offer a slight variation on this. So he developed a technique known as CANs, Creative Adversarial Networks, that was based on that logic. In other words, you had a database of modernist artwork and you offered a slight variation on that went slightly outside the boundaries of that definition in order to move it forward, but at the same time was recognizable within that tradition. And it seems to me that's the same situation we have. It's a similar situation that we have in architecture. We have a canon of architecture, and we never vary too much from that canon. We keep within those constraints, but at the same time, we try and nudge it forward slightly. And even when we find there are some people who clearly break away, who are game changers, who introduce something radically different to what happened before, they themselves, in some ways, end up replicating. They're copying them themselves. For example, Frank Gehry, with his design for the Guggenheim in Bilbao on the left-hand side, was a radical game changer. Back in the 1990s, it really opened up a new way of expressing. At the same time, we can see later buildings by Frank Gehry on the right hand side, the Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA and in Los Angeles, that look really similar to that, as though he is copying his own way of operating. From that point of view, we could say this is the signature of Frank Gehry. He is it's recognizably Gehry. And likewise, one could see that maybe he is constrained, like the pieces on the chessboard, to always operate in the same way. Human beings, to that extent, are governed by their own signatures.